Hello. Due to the high number of requests, I'm going to give a review summary of my doctoral thesis. My name is Bryant Lazaro. I had the privilege of defending my PhD on March 6, 2023 at the UCAM University in Spain. I'm going to give a review of this doctoral thesis in two languages, English and Spanish, so that the many questions I've received regarding the content of this 7-year process can be brought to light for all of you to take in. Iniciaré el resumen de mi tesis doctoral que tiene por título Validación de un modelo competencial para la evaluación del rendimiento y detección del talento de los jugadores de fútbol base en las categorías infantil, cadete y juvenil. Caso de la cantera de un club de fútbol español. The title of my doctoral thesis is Validation of a Competency Model to Evaluate Performance and Identify Talent in Developmental Categories. Case of an Elite Spanish Football Club. I'm originally from the United States, but had the luck to grow up in many countries, including Canada and Argentina. I've also been privileged to have worked in many elite football clubs throughout my career, including Levante in Spain, Sevilla FC in south of Spain, Tromsø in northern Norway, Deportivo Cuenca in Ecuador, and currently a coach in Vålerenga IF, a club in Oslo, Norway. Soy originalmente de Estados Unidos. He tenido la fortuna de crecer en varios países, incluyendo Canadá y Argentina, y me dedico a ser entrenador profesional de fútbol. He tenido el privilegio de entrenar en clubes de élite como Levante Unión Deportiva, el Sevilla Fútbol Club, el Tromsø, el Club Deportivo Cuenca y actualmente trabajando como entrenador en el filial de Vålerenga IF, que está basada en Oslo, Noruega. In this review, I'm going to be touching on an introduction, a theoretical foundation, the objectives of my doctoral thesis, the hypothesis I came up with, the method in which I realized my investigation, the results, the conclusions, the limitations, the future lines of research, and the scientific contributions. En este resumen voy a ver la introducción, la fundación teórica, los objetivos, las hipótesis de investigación, el método de investigación, los resultados, las conclusiones, las limitaciones y las futuras líneas de investigación. Y para terminar, las contribuciones científicas. As a professional football coach, my first train of thought when evaluating performance was the following. In sport, the competition serves as a quantitative mechanism to recognize excellence. This, for me, was always very clear that the way to recognize peak performance involved simply observing how players performed in competition on the field. One of the most singular characteristics of football is its unpredictability. This plays a factor in analyzing football from any angle because of how unpredictable it is. It's extremely difficult to foresee what will happen. So as a football coach, I always thought that if I could minimize the unpredictability, I would have a greater hand at influencing what was on the field. Una de las características singulares de fútbol es su imprevisibilidad. Esto es entendido en el fútbol que es un deporte que es muy difícil predecir y saber lo que va a pasar. Por lo tanto, yo como técnico de fútbol siempre quería minimizar esa imprevisibilidad para poder tener más control sobre lo que está pasando con mis jugadores en el terreno de juego. And we see here two examples, Leicester City winning the Premier League and River Plate being relegated as unpredictable situations that can occur in the sport. Football is a multifaceted and complex sport in the sense that it requires many factors to be evaluated. And when I say factors, I'm referring to the physical aspect, the technical aspect, the psychosocial aspect, and the tactical aspects. El fútbol es un deporte con muchas facetas y requiere un análisis profundo de todos los aspectos. Cuando digo aspectos, me refiero a lo físico, a lo técnico, a lo psicosocial y a lo táctico. So we have an idea of how many aspects can encompass football in terms of developing elite players, as shown in this study by Pazzo et al. The keys to developing player is very all-encompassing. You don't just evaluate the technique and the positional work. You also evaluate the individual psychological aspect. You look at the physical aspect in every sense, knowing that a football player can have different shapes and sizes, especially when you compare it to other sport, it's much more inclusive. And then there's the sporting context of what happens with the player off the field. And all of this has to be incorporated in a team game. So it has to be analyzed from a collective perspective as well. Claves en la formación de los jugadores según los coordinadores en este estudio de Pazzo et al. Básicamente nos enseña que hay muchos contextos para analizar, no solo lo extradeportivo, lo que pasa fuera del campo, sino también todo a nivel individual dentro del campo y también a nivel colectivo, porque al final el fútbol es un deporte colectivo. In recent years, the emergence of big data has been significant, and the amount of data scientists being hired at the club level is a clear indicator of this. Along with big data, artificial intelligence companies such as Olasip have come into the market. Artificial intelligence companies are assisting with interpreting large amounts of data for scouting departments to receive on players, coaches, and teams. Últimamente, la influencia de Big Data y inteligencia artificial está cada vez mayor. Big Data son esencialmente todas las estadísticas que tienen que ver con un jugador de fútbol y su rendimiento en el terreno de juego. Y la inteligencia artificial ahora mismo, con empresas como Olasip, por ejemplo, están trabajando en interpretar esos datos que estamos recibiendo a través de Big Data. Por lo tanto, estos dos componentes están jugando un parte importante en el fútbol moderno. So basically, when I did the due diligence for before writing my doctoral thesis, I eventually came up to this question that I asked myself. Is there enough quantitative resources in football that measure and analyze the performance of players, both at youth and professional level? And the answer to this question, after I took my time in deciding whether I was going to investigate this further, was to design, validate, and apply a competency model for elite football players that serves as an analytical tool for players, coaches, and using this case of a Spanish elite football club in the U13 to U19 categories. Tras pensar y hacer mis propias investigaciones antes de tomar la decisión de perseguir un doctorado en fútbol, he tomado un tiempo para reflejar y generar una pregunta hacia mí mismo, que era lo siguiente. ¿Hay suficientes recursos cuantitativos en el fútbol moderno que nos permite medir y analizar el rendimiento de jugadores de fútbol, tanto a nivel formativo que a nivel profesional? Y la respuesta que me surgió fue para diseñar, validar y aplicar un modelo competencial para jugadores de fútbol de élite que nos puede servir como un recurso analítico para jugadores y entrenadores, en este caso en un club de fútbol de élite español, en las categorías infantil, cadete y juvenil. An important quote as the last train of thought before we get into the actual doctoral thesis was a quote from Luis Enrique Martinez, the former Barcelona, AS Roma, and Spanish national team coach. I completely disagree with those who say that there is nothing more to invent in football. Una frase que me queda grabada en la memoria es de Luis Enrique, ex entrenador de la selección de España, entre otros, y eso es: estoy en desacuerdo total con las personas que piensan que en el fútbol está todo inventado. On the right, we see Mr. Marcelo Bielsa, who played a big role in my personal development as a coach, and I'm very honored to have spent time with him and learned from him. He, on the picture on the right-hand side, has invented a way for players to visualize their positional work, both on a screen and on a football board, where he can reinforce his tactics. So someone being used in this light as innovative and constantly thinking there are new ways to improve how we coach players. Football is the king of all sports. Fútbol es el deporte rey. There's more than 2,600 million participants. Hay más de 2,600 millones de participantes. Furthermore, when looking past its popularity, it's a sport that's influenced by mental factors and everything that's involved in the context of that given player and his environment, his or her environment. That includes technical and tactical factors, which are often intertwined between each other, technical and tactical, and physical factors. Además de su popularidad, es un juego que está influido por factores mentales y contextuales, factores técnicos y tácticos que casi siempre están mezclados entre ellos, y factores físicos. The normal thing when a player stands out, he obtains success through the game itself. So it's normal that historically we've always studied the players that demonstrate excellence and are successful in the sport. But what do we need to be successful in this context? Many things, such as listed in this study from Chien in 1989, commitment, efficiency, motor skills, proper movement, genetic disposition, conditional capacity, talent for the game, and a maximum level of sacrifice. Lo normal cuando un deportista destaca consigue éxito en el juego. ¿Y qué hay que hacer para ser exitoso en este contexto? Muchas cosas. Por ejemplo, entrega, eficacia en partidos, máximo nivel de presentación, talento para el juego, estado de preparación elemental, entre otros. 20 years ago, more or less, in Spain and Portugal, emerged what I consider to be the most influential way of training players in terms of schools of thought. In Portugal was born an idea called tactical periodization. This, of course, was influenced from many cultures in Europe and brought together essentially to use your game model as the core reference in everything you do in terms of your training method. Meaning All of your exercises should have the game model at the heart of it when you're working on the physical, the technical, the tactical, and the mental aspects of your game model. So it's about defining a game model with principles and sub-principles and using that as a clear reference in everything you do when coaching the players. Hace 20 años en España y Portugal surge una metodología de formar talento, lo cual he aprendido tanto en el Levante como en el Sevilla, que es tener un modelo de juego como referencia en los entrenamientos y partidos. En Portugal nació esta escuela de pensamiento que se llama periodización táctica, que es un concepto muy profundo para entrenar a sus jugadores. En definitivo, lo fundamental en esta forma de entrenar es tener un modelo de juego al centro de todo lo que se hace en los entrenamientos, trabajando los principios y subprincipios de su modelo. Football gets even more complicated, as shown in this study by Conrad et al., and that there's a mental fatigue component. Según Conrad et al., no hay solo un cansancio físico, sino también mental. Esto hace que los aspectos del juego se pueden mezclar. Esto aumenta la complejidad del análisis en el fútbol. Now getting into the specifics of my doctoral thesis after this introduction. The general objective of my doctoral thesis was to validate and apply a competency model as a resource to determine the performance levels in soccer from players age U13 to U19 in Spanish football context. El objetivo general de mi tesis es validar y aplicar un modelo competencial como herramienta para evaluar y determinar el nivel de competencia y rendimiento deportivo en las categorías infantil, cadete y juvenil de un club de fútbol de élite. The specific objectives within that general objective were the following three. Number one, design and validate a methodology using a competency model in developmental group youth football, U13 to U19 age groups. The second one was to revalidate this model a second time in the Sevilla FC academy. And the third specific objective was to apply and analyze the perception of the coach and the perception of the player regarding his or her psychological, tactical, technical, and physical competencies in relation to that player's position on the field and in relation to the category, the age group in which that player participates. Los tres objetivos específicos son los siguientes: diseñar y validar la metodología del modelo competencial del fútbol base en las categorías infantil, cadete y juvenil, revalidar el modelo a la cantera del Sevilla Fútbol Club en las categorías de infantil, cadete y juvenil, y el último, aplicar y analizar la percepción del entrenador y del jugador de fútbol base sobre las competencias psicológicas, tácticas, técnicas y físicas del jugador en función del puesto que ocupa en el terreno de juego y en función de la categoría en la que juega. So, regarding the third specific objective out of the three I just mentioned, if we look at the third one, which is listed at the top of the screen, I came up with 4 hypotheses as a result of this third specific objective. The 4 hypotheses, very quickly, I will state them. It's that the perception that the coach and the player has over the player's own psychological, tactical, technical, and physical competencies differ. The second one is that the perception that the coach and the player has regarding the psychological, tactical, technical, and physical competencies differ in function of which category the player plays in. The third hypothesis, the perception that the coach and the player have regarding their competencies of the forementioned aspects differ in function of the position they play on the field. And the fourth and last hypothesis is that the self-perception that the player has over himself when evaluating psychological, tactical, technical, and physical competencies are different with respect to the category that that player participates in. Those who speak Spanish can read the screen and understand the hypothesis clearly. With regards to the method of how I conducted and delivered my research, I used a multi-method approach, which is common amongst this type of doctoral research. It can be best summarized by understanding that I did three studies within my doctoral thesis for me to collect enough data to come up with viable conclusions. And the following three studies are as follows. I designed, validated the methodology of the competency model within the Valencian Regional Football League for the U13 to U19 age groups. That was the first study. The second study, I revalidated the competency model I designed in the first study, except this time I applied it to Sevilla Football Club youth teams. In the third study, I applied and analyzed the perception that coaches and players had for this competency model, again in the Sevilla FC U13 to U19 age groups, taking into account their position, the player's position on the field, and the category in which they played in. It's extremely important to note that I used a statistical analysis with regards to all of the data I acquired. I had access to the statistical package for the social sciences using the license from the Universidad Politécnica de Valencia. So this allowed me to do my statistical analysis on the relevant data. Looking at case study 1, it can be broken down into two parts. I designed the competency model and I validated so that it could be used as an evaluational resource. What steps did I take in study number 1? I designed every aspect of the questionnaire, which became the competency model. I validated the rating system, the Likert rating system. I evaluated it, doing a test and retest with 2 subgroups. And from there, I came up with my final questionnaire in this study. And after doing the relevant tests on the questionnaire, it allowed me to confirm its validity. How did we confirm its validity? We did an internal validation and an external validation. So using a mixed methodology, it first started out by doing an extensive bibliographical review using committee experts who were able to filter the correct information and the information that should be removed from the questionnaire. And I also did the external validation, where I used the ANOVA statistical analysis, the variance analysis, using 2 variables, whether it was the second team or not, and position of the player. The expert committee that helped me validate The competency model in the first study was made up of 30 professionals of football. The second expert committee was made up of 13. The instrument was 4 blocks of questions, 46 items from Likert, with 6 options of answers, 0 to 5. So 0 being the weakest and 5 being the biggest. The first expert committee, as I said, was made up of 30 people, coaches, directors of clubs, scouts, all with UEFA A or UEFA Pro license. They reviewed 4 blocks of questions, and they also assisted me and did an extensive bibliographical review to make sure that what I was designing in terms of my questionnaire was original and valid. The first subgroup I mentioned was made up of 7 experts. We had coaches with the UEFA Pro license, and we used, through the statistical package I explained earlier, we ran the test of the Aiken test, which gave us the results of 0.76 to 0.85, which are considered adequate to validate through the first subgroup this questionnaire. The second subgroup made up of 6 people, so 7 in the first, 6 in the second, that's 13 in total in these 2 subgroups. And again, we used the Aiken test to complete the same validity. So we did it twice with 2 subgroups. These were the filtered and improved documents. So you can see them here in Spanish, as I did my doctoral thesis in Spanish with parts in English. But the competency model currently is being translated to English. But this is the Spanish version of the first draft that went through the expert committee. So this expert committee, as I said, they rated the specificity and relevance of all the levels explained from 0 to 10. Each situation, as you'll see on the left-hand side, describes a game scenario and how well the player deals with that scenario. 0 being unable to fulfill what's needed in that game situation, and number 5 is achieving excellence in that game action. On the right-hand side, you see the items of the questionnaire. So all of the things that were addressed, 37 competencies. You can see here in Spanish, visualizing the defense, fair play, resistance to frustration, goal setting, how he is technically with the ball, defending 1v1. These are just some examples of all the competencies analyzed. So validation of the final scale involved this many experts, 24 coaches, 240 players. We used it on the entire Valencian regional league. We did this analysis using the different factors, and our results came between 5.1 and 8.9, which is sufficient to rate the structure of the questionnaire as adequate. So we did an analysis of internal consistency where we used the alpha de Cronbach coefficient. So this statistical analysis shows us that the final result was 0.90, which again proves that the alpha de Cronbach test was successful when checking the validity of this definitive scale regarding the first study of this competency model. Here we can visualize the first draft of the competency model. As I said earlier, 3 studies allowed me to validate and confirm this competency model. In the first study, we are just validating it. So this was the first draft of the competency model that I produced. Acá se puede visualizar la propuesta piloto del modelo competencial usando como ejemplo aspectos psicosociales. Los demás han sido de la misma forma, que está reflejado en la tesis como anexo 3. So some results of the case study 1. What's important to see here is that the three factors, including attack, defense, and personal aspects, these three factors were what stood out when the data came out. They made up for 73.50% of the variance observed. So these results obtained in the factorial analysis show that there is enough sufficient evidence to infer that the questionnaire is correctly structured. In this table, you can see in Spanish the data obtained and the actions realized in the case study 1. And what's most important here to see is basically a breakdown of how I validated the competency model, how many experts I used in both my internal and external validation, how many players I used, the types of tests I used, including Videakin and Alpha de Cronbach. And this is a good summary of the action I took in my first study. Some results from the first study include that there are 37 variables that I listed earlier, 37 competencies that I decided would be relevant after testing its validity to continue using in the future. So it's 37 variables. Within those 37 variables, there are 10 dimensions. Internal control of the player, so everything that the player controls, his own motivation, his work ethic, his commitment. The external control, how the player handles external factors such as coaching decisions, referees, the opponent, the media, family life. Tactics and attack, tactics and defense, tactics and offensive transition, tactics and defensive transition, technical concepts with the ball, technical concepts without the ball, physical aspects, and the optimization of performance. So the most important results, besides these 37 variables and 10 dimensions, were that the four evaluational criteria are the psychosocial, the psychological aspect, the technical aspect, the tactical aspect, and the physical aspect. The competency model that I designed in the first study is a valid and dependable instrument because of the Alpha de Cronbach tests, and this is fundamental going forward. En cuanto a resultados importantes del primer estudio, el modelo competencial es una herramienta válida con un índice de fiabilidad adecuado. La concepción de la escala del cuestionario se percibe desde 3 dimensiones: ataque, defensa y aspectos personales. Se considera que los 4 criterios evaluativos son fundamentales para analizar fútbol en una manera más completo. Es por ello que los 37 variables y 10 dimensiones engloban lo psicosocial, lo técnico, lo táctico y lo físico. Moving on to the second study, seguimos con el estudio 2. Although the instrument has been validated and created as explained in the first study, it was necessary, in my view, to revalidate it and go through a second test of this competency model, given its importance in this field. So what did I do in the second study? The competency model designed in the first study was applied in Sevilla Football Club in the U13 to U19 age groups, and it was validated and confirmed as a competency model and improved from the first version, the draft version, the pilot version that was made in the first study. Aunque es un instrumento que está validado en contenido por jueces expertos y descrito en el estudio anterior, se considera necesario realizar no solo una revalidación de la herramienta con otro comité de expertos, sino con otra muestra de jugadores y entrenadores debido a que se realiza la evaluación de las competencias a través de la percepción. Es por ello que el estudio 2 se trata de aplicar, revalidar y confirmar el instrumento piloto en la cantera del Sevilla Fútbol Club. In the second case study, we used a similar mixed methodology with another set of expert committee using the quantitative techniques we used in the first study, this time using the human resources of the very competent academy coaches in Sevilla Football Club, which was made up of 20 professionals, including 6 coaches. As I mentioned, 20 people, 6 coaches with the UEFA Pro license, 4 academy directors, 4 methodology directors, and 6 professional players. What are the criteria and sub-criteria of this competency model? Psychological and social, tactical, technical, and physical. Here's a more descriptive view from the 0 to 6 range of valuation that I mentioned earlier, 0 being the least and 5 being the most, so 6 options. Finalmente, el comité de expertos en el segundo estudio se cambió el nombre de dimensión por subcriterio para dar más consistencia a la estructura de modelo competencial de 4 criterios y 10 subcriterios que se puede visualizar en esta figura. Abajo de esta figura también se puede apreciar los 6 niveles competenciales usados en el instrumento. So the committee of experts in the second study filtered out and changed some terms in the competency model. They changed the name dimension to sub-criteria to give more consistency to the competency model structure. So some important results from the second study include that the second revalidation of the competency model came out as 0.86, which indicates that it's a consistent, dependable model, and it validates the competency model going forward. It also allowed the competency model to define its 4 evaluative criteria for the coaches and the players. These 4 criteria are designed in 10 sub-criteria that I mentioned earlier. The final version of the competency model is what you can see now on the screen. You can visualize all of what I've explained leading up to this, which includes the 4 aspects which are listed here as criteria, the sub-criteria, the competencies, the 37 competencies that are used for rating, and then the scale on the right, where 0 to 5 Likert type evaluation for the players, which can then be rated from 0 to 100. The evaluational scale used in the competency model can be seen here. So there are 37 in total, going over the 37 competencies that I showed you earlier. And each coach and player who filled out this competency model had to fill out 37 of these rating the player rating his own perception of these skills, and the coach rating the player. And this was done 37 times under the supervision of Sevilla Football Club and myself. And this is a very specific, very thorough process, and that's why it was so important to support the coaches and the players so this competency model can be filled out in the most accurate possible way. Las dos matrices que se visualiza a continuación sirven como base para realizar la evaluación competencial del jugador de fútbol, mediante la identificación de evidencias del jugador durante el desempeño de sus entrenamientos, concentraciones y partidos de fútbol. Por lo tanto, un total de 37 matrices de evaluación definidas en el marco del modelo competencial. Se trata de un conjunto de cuestionarios con respuestas en una estructura matricial con 6 niveles, como se ha explicado anteriormente. The final study, the third one, had a clear objective of applying and analyzing the perception of the competency model in Sevilla Football Club from both coaches and players in the U13 to U19 categories in function of the position the player plays in and the category the player participates in, the age group. So the two objectives of this study and what was achieved are to determine the perception that the coach and the player has over their own evaluation of the psychological, tactical, technical, and physical competencies in relation to the position and the category that the player plays in, and also to evaluate the competency level of the player and establish differences between the relevant age groups. El estudio 3 tiene por título Aplicación y análisis de la percepción del modelo competencial en la cantera del Sevilla Fútbol Club en función de la categoría y del puesto del jugador en el terreno de juego. Tiene como dos objetivos claros determinar la percepción que tiene el entrenador y el jugador de fútbol sobre la evaluación de las competencias del jugador en función del puesto que ocupa y de la categoría en la que juega. Y también para evaluar el nivel competencial del jugador de fútbol y establecer diferencias entre los equipos evaluados. So for this third study, there was a statistical analysis conducted applying the definitive competency model, which was confirmed after the first two studies. We used 66 participants, including 6 coaches from 6 different teams, 3 age groups. In the U13 to U19 age group, infantil, cadet, and juvenil, which is U13 to U19 in Spain. And we used 2 teams from each category, 6 teams in total. The process was rigorous. We had to get permission and inform Sevilla FC and its academy director, Mr. Pablo Blanco. We had to set up meetings with the coaches and the parents to explain to them how the study was going to go. We had to have educational clinics with the coaching staffs to have them better understand what exactly the competency model and the questionnaires were for. We had the coaches evaluate online what they thought of this process, and within 1 week, we were able to get all of the competency models filled out from all the players and coaches. El diseño del estudio viene por un análisis estadístico aplicando el modelo competencial definido en el segundo estudio, usando la muestra y el procedimiento que se puede visualizar. So just some statistical analysis to give you an idea. The self-perception of the players was done in relation to what position that player played in on the field and in relation to what age group he was. So on the left-hand side, these results show that puesto position, the one that had psychologically the most confidence psychologically was the offensive midfielder player, which surprised me because before I started this research, I was certain it would have been the striker. On the right-hand side, in the categories, you can see that the self-evaluation that the player does and that the coach does is influenced by the position that player plays on the field. The differences in the perception from the players and the coaches in function of the position they play and the category they play in. The standout aspects were the psychological and the physical, especially with the defensive midfielders and the organizational midfielders. These two stood out in those aspects. En esta tabla se aprecian los resultados obtenidos en cuanto a la diferencia entre la autopercepción del jugador y la valoración que hace su entrenador de cada uno de los criterios que forman parte del modelo competencial en función de la posición que ocupa el jugador y de la categoría en la que juega. Las mayores diferencias en cuanto a la percepción de los ámbitos psicológicos y físicos en las posiciones de los jugadores se producen en los mediocentros defensivos y mediocentros organizadores. En estos casos, el entrenador valora a estos jugadores alrededor de 8 y 7 puntos menos en comparación a la evaluación realizada por dichos jugadores. So some further results from the third study. When you look at the four aspects, the U13 to U15 categories, in Spanish is called the categoría infantil in Spain, showed the lowest points in compared to the other categories in the psychological domain. They did, however, have the highest self-rating in terms of the playing position, as I said earlier, in the offensive midfielders. In terms of the tactical criteria, the defensive midfielder, the organizational midfielder, and the offensive midfielder showed the highest ratings from both the players and the coaches, and this was a repeat in the technical criteria. In the physical criteria, the standout result was that the defensive midfielders in the U16, U17 age groups had the lowest average rating. So earlier I explained the four hypotheses. Anteriormente he nombrado los cuatro hipótesis, and 3 out of the 4 hypotheses were confirmed after I conducted my research. So we can see here that the first, second, and fourth hypothesis were confirmed. The third hypothesis, which was that the perception of the coach and the player regarding the evaluation of competencies in the psychological, tactical, technical, and physical aspects differed in the position they play on the field and the category in which they play, the age group. So that was the only hypothesis that did not come to fruition. So before we move on, this is a review of the 3 studies that were completed to arrive to the end of my thesis, where conclusions began to formulate. The first study, the second study, and the third study, each study being progressive and leading to each other. and strengthening each other. The first study was designing and validating the competency model using the regional league in Valencia, Spain. The second study was revalidating that first draft pilot model in the Sevilla FC U13 and U19 categories. And the third and final study was to apply this definitive competency model and analyze the perception of both coaches and players in the Sevilla FC club structure in the U13 to U19 age groups, so that the players could be analyzed in relation to what position they play on the field and what category they participate in. And all of this was done so we could evaluate the competencies of the players, both from their own point of view and the coach's point of view, and to establish differences between the teams. Some key conclusions include that the method used to create, validate, define, and apply this competency model is valid and efficient. The competency model instrument facilitates relevant information regarding players' ability to resolve different game-like scenarios. The competency model allows for a closer analysis of the situation required by the coach in each of the criteria. Therefore, it aids the players to improve their level of understanding of what is being demanded from them on the field, which reaffirms the effectiveness of this instrument. Further conclusions show that a similar tendency in all player categories were shown where the coach had a lower evaluation than the player did on themselves, meaning that the coach has a higher demand on the players in comparison to the players themselves. Players who have a greater desire to improve can apply the competency model on themselves, meaning they can have another resource besides the coaching staff to identify areas of development. Study limitations, limitaciones del estudio, included the subjectivity of the competency model, extremely challenging to confirm that every single player and coach was answering all 37 parts of the competency model with 100% accuracy. The lack of maturity of the players in the U13 and U15 infantil age groups, particularly in self-perception. The tactical and technical criteria is evaluated separately, and in football, the tactical and technical is often evaluated together. The competency model was only applied in one club, which was another limitation, and there was a need to constantly use the competency model for comparative data. Limitaciones de este estudio incluye subjetividad del modelo competencial, la falta de madurez de la categoría infantil cuando realizan el cuestionario evaluando a sí mismo. El criterio técnico y táctico está evaluado de manera separada, y eso en el fútbol no es compatible. El hecho que en el fútbol el técnico y lo táctico está casi siempre mezclado. El modelo competencial solo ha sido aplicado en un club de fútbol, y siempre hay una necesidad de comparar con otras muestras para entender mejor los resultados. Future lines of research include applying the competency model at 3 different phases, before, during, and after training, to gain a more complete insight of the players. This would be useful, of course, in team planning. Including more competencies that allowed for a deeper analysis of stress levels experienced by the players. This variable requires better understanding to recognize key differences in age groups. Para futuras líneas de investigación, una propuesta de iniciativas para considerar en un futuro son que el modelo competencial sea aplicada en 3 fases diferentes, antes, durante y después del entrenamiento, para tener una información más global con respecto a los jugadores, y en consecuencia eso puede ayudar para planificar mejor la gestión del equipo, los entrenamientos del equipo. También para incluir más competencias con respecto a niveles de estrés, que puede vivir los jugadores de fútbol. Este variable requiere un mejor entendimiento de las diferencias entre las categorías de fútbol. Other proposals for future initiatives include applying the competency model to a wider range of teams and age groups, apply the competency model to senior professional players only, apply the competency models also to female players, coaches, and teams. También para aplicar el modelo competencial a más variedad en cuanto a edad en equipos de fútbol, para aplicarlo también a jugadores profesionales, y también para el fútbol femenino aplicarlo a jugadoras, entrenadoras y equipos femeninos. Regarding scientific contributions of this doctoral thesis, 3 articles have been published in accredited sport journals. As you can see on the screen, the 3 articles that were published were regarding the 3 different studies that make up my doctoral thesis. So before the defense of my thesis in March 2023, this was published and confirmed in the scientific journals that you can see before you. En cuanto a contribuciones científicas, se puede visualizar en los 3 periódicos deportivos acreditados. Se ha publicado artículos relacionados a mi tesis doctoral. Esto fue antes de defender mi tesis doctoral de manera exitosa en marzo de 2023. I have not stopped working on my competency model. I'm currently creating a digital version of it so that it can be applied instantly and more effectively. It's a work in progress, so I have not stopped. Although I have completed the doctorate, my work continues, and I think this will allow for a faster and easier analysis of the data once I have this digital version in several languages ready for application. El desarrollo de mi modelo competencial no ha parado, se está digitalizando ahora mismo en varios idiomas para poder aplicarlo de manera más rápida y eficiente. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this review of my doctoral thesis, which has taken me over 7 years of intense and consistent study, has been helpful to you, for all the technicians out there in football who want to continue growing and improving and finding new ways to develop talent. Gracias por vuestra atención. Espero que esta presentación, este resumen de mi tesis doctoral, que han sido 7 años de trabajo constante, ha sido fructífero para todos ustedes, para poder entender y valorar el trabajo que he hecho durante todo este tiempo, y que también os puede motivar e inspirar para nunca estar quieto y seguir encontrando formas de mejorar talentos en el fútbol, que nos pueda ayudar a todos los técnicos de fútbol que hay en este mundo. I was honored to have been graded outstanding cum laude when I defended my thesis in March of 2023. I want to give a special mention to the panel that was involved in evaluating my thesis, Dr. André Seabra from the Portuguese Football Federation. It was an honor for him to be president of the committee that evaluated my thesis, a person who has inspired me with his both academic and football work to push the limits and always go for more. I also want to thank Dr. Andrés Tudela, who is someone who has worked in many areas of football, also at such a young age. He is currently in Valencia, in the university in Valencia, as a professor. I want to thank him for forming part of the tribunal. Dr. Alberto Castillo, excuse the mispronunciation. Dr. Castillo is coaching professionally in UCAM Murcia, the club, responsible for the reserves. He's also a professor in Universidad Católica de Murcia, and getting his insight and his feedback regarding my doctoral thesis as a tribunal member was greatly appreciated. A special mention to my directors who guided me throughout the 7-year process: Dr. Ana Maria Gallardo Guerrero, Dr. Marta Garcia Tascon, and Dr. Jose Jabaloyes. These 3 people were fundamental in allowing me to complete the thesis, and were most supportive in the most difficult times, and I will always remember their contribution to making all of this possible. Quiero agradecer de manera especial a los miembros de tribunal que han asistido y evaluado mi tesis doctoral: Dr. Andrés Seabra, Dr. Andrés Tudela y el Dr. Alberto Castillo. Quiero dar las gracias a ellos 3 por su valoración, su tiempo y sus contribuciones a mejorar este modelo competencial. He sido honrado con una valoración final de sobresaliente cum laude. Of course, none of this would not have been possible without the support of my family, without the support of the Next Generation Sports and its director, Ivan Salazar. And I also want to mention 2 coaches who have made the biggest impression on me, both professionally and personally. That's Ian Cathro and Marcelo Bielsa. Nada de esto hubiese sido posible sin el apoyo incondicional de mi familia. Quiero mencionar a ellos. También quiero agradecer a la empresa The Next Generation Sports y su director, Iván Salazar. También me gustaría nombrar a 2 personas, 2 entrenadores que han tenido una influencia en mí muy grande a nivel personal y profesional. Esas 2 personas son Ian Cathro y Marcelo Bielsa. Thank you very much for your attention. Muchas gracias por vuestra atención.